Hello everyone, it is Joe here from OmniPoke, the channel that brings you guys everything Pokemon. If you're looking for PTCG live codes, make sure you check out the Potown store. You can get a 5% discount on your orders using that code OmniPoke. For today's video, we're going to be going over the top 10 decks in the standard format. This is post-rotation with Journey Together cards included, of course, because the Atlanta Regional Championships is happening this weekend, and then following on from that, there are more tournaments. Of course, there are special events happening in Europe as well, which I'm going to be attending, so I've been keeping a close eye on a whole heap of decks. I've been playtesting a bunch and looking at the online data. The 10 decks, the list this time around is going to be purely based on the online results, but of course the deck lists themselves and potential tech inclusions that I want to discuss will be more from my own playtesting and what I feel like are the right things to prioritize going into the next set of tournaments. So let's get on with it. Starting with number 10, you're always going to see the popularity of the deck list in the top right of your screen as well. And we're going to start things off looking at the matchup overview. Now, these percentages are broken down via Trainer Hill. These are not my personal opinions. These are the data that we have from the online scene over the last 2 or 3 weeks or so, ever since we had the change coming in to PTG Live. But Charizard seems to be underplayed. I can see why it's not a popular archetype though, because Charizard Pidgeot is definitely diminishing, and that deck's data is terrible, to be honest with you. It's really not performing too well. This deck seems to be the better approach, where we utilize Noctowl a little bit more. There's just too much Badoo out there, there's too much Bench Snipe, there's too much Monkey Dory, there's too much Dragapult pings. It's just too easy for Pidgeys to be KO'd. So getting multiple Hoot down is just a safer approach really to try and get into our candy combinations with our Charizard. And at the same time, that Jewel Seeker gives us a different attacking threat, as the Terapagos being a basic attacking option that can also help you get around Cornerstone, which is more important now because there are many more walling decks around the metagame. Even though we're not going to talk about many of them specifically today, you'll notice that a bunch of our deck lists have answers to these walling Pokemon because they have popped up here and there in Japanese tournaments, certainly, to have really far and deep finishes. So definitely worthwhile considering your options against the Mimikyus, the Cornerstones, the Milotics, the Farigirafs throughout this video. And that's part of the reason why we are going down a Terra approach, because just Charizard isn't enough of an option these days. Looking more detail into the matchup spread here, you can see why Charizard's not that great though. There's still the issue of Dragapult in both forms. This is a Dusknoir form as well as a pure Dragapult, with just the Monkey Dory, often a Blood Moon, often, multiple Budgie in that sort of list. That's the distinction I have going on there, and Gardevoir is also awkward. So into the other Stage 2s, this deck is not so hot. The big boasts, however, are Golden Go, as well as the new tanking Terapagos archetype. What I do think is really strong about Charizard, as we get a look at the deck list in a moment, we are really good at still sculpting that Briar play. We still play Dusknoir, we still have Briar, we have Noctowl that can help us get there, so it still is quite easy for us to, against the multi-prize 2-2-2 racing decks, only attack twice and yet have taken 6 prizes in the process, with Dusknoir giving us 1 prize and Briar providing 3 prize cards. It's very easy for us to make that happen, which is still so powerful for the archetype. Looking at the deck list in detail then, the A spec right now is the maximum belt that can help Charizard push its numbers more proactively, which is important because there are just even more basic EXs out there right now, and obviously the Vs have left the format, so we're attacking into basically everything high damage output wise with this tool now. And like I said, Briar's in a really important one of, we have the Chorus of Tenacity that can get the Underdepths to open up our bench, which is kind of interesting, as well as get that Jet Energy, which can sometimes allow us to get aggressive with Fan Rotom if need be as well, which is kind of cool, or get our Terapagos into the active, which is nice. There's the Jacques Supporter, which I personally really like in the deck as well, that can get a second Noctowl in addition to a Charizard that can then allow you to use a second Jewel Seeker for even more actions, so that can be a really good hack. Also, it can allow you to evolve your vulnerable 60 hit point Duskull into Dusclops, whilst also getting that candy piece for Charizard. So I do definitely like the supporter as a one-of within the deck list. Not too much else surprising here. We are, cutting the corners with the 1 Terra Orb in here that can help us get Terapagos, which just unlocks Jewel Seeker in the first place, but it can also be, if we've already found Terapagos, we can get that Terra Orb easily, so not having to spend that Ultra Ball for the Charizard EX as well. But yeah, you can see the risk of this archetype, but definitely still has a lot of internal power behind it, and we know Charizard's just still such a powerful card in general that it can still go quite far in tournaments, I think. In at number 9, we have the N Zoroark then, one of these trainers Pokemon being debuted from Journey Together. Its popularity has been ninth most as well in the online scene, so pretty in line in that regard. Its matchup data really isn't that appealing though. It seems like its only good matchups are Hop Zacian, and then even into Charizard and Gardevoir. These are not boasts. Having really tough times into a lot of these other Noctowl engines, you know, the Raging Bolt, the Terra Box, the tanking Terrapagos. There's just a lot of decks that might have, you know, better engines, you could say, which is a bit of concern for this deck. At the same time, when you're not that strong into Dragapult, that's also somewhat of a concern. And then there's also Golden Go and Archaludon. You know, it feels like it's just not the best positioned deck, or possibly the list hasn't been ironed out perfectly yet either. So that's something to consider. We know this ability is powerful. We know there are strong elements of this attacker in that it can copy bench sniping whilst also having an outrage attack. So there certainly are situations you can put your opponent in with this card, but that consistent damage output where you're sort of less reactionary is the big issue I've found with the deck personally. The deck list I've gone for is still sort of the best performing from the online scene, which is really still based off of that Champions League list in the first place. So there hasn't been much innovation from the early stages of this archetype, unfortunately. I have messed around with a double Petulant, multiple Mochi list with Perilous Jungle. I think that's intriguing, but it's not a list that I'm ready to show just yet because it's still being ironed out. So yeah, Zoroark, we know that trade is busted, we know that there are some good attacks to copy here, and we know that you are a defensive deck with the Stamp and the Ionos that can give you some win condition in the first place, but it still feels like you're high-rolling a little bit more with this deck than trying to do it all with a Noctowl from my experience. In at number 8, we have Gardevoir. This is an interesting one. It has quite a wide matchup spread. It's solid into Charizard, Hop Zacian, and Raging Bolt. Also quite happy into Dragapult Dusknoir, which is already going to be an exciting prospect in that we have Lily's Clefairy plus Mew EX as a powerful combination within the archetype, and even using our single prize Pokemon to uptrade into the Dragapult much more easily as well. So that's a big boast for Gardevoir, really, going into this format. It does seem to have a slightly worse time into straight Dragapult, and now I think that's because that list is much more inclined to go Budju and just deny Rare Candy and possibly, get attacking in when they can combine Hawlucha and KOing, the Rolts before they get into Gardevoir, something like that is potentially a concern, whereas the Dusknoir might have a more clunky time of things comparatively. So that's just a small note there, more than anything else. But yeah, it does seem like it's not flawless because you are much more candy reliant with the new build of Gardevoir when you no longer have refinements. But that is one of the more problematic matchups. So too is the Archaludon matchup. I think when you don't have Fez activation for your early game, when they're taking prizes via poison KOs, I think that's a small headache. And of course, they're very comfortable just utilizing lots of their single prize Pokemon because you're so often damaging your own dudes. That's a bit of a problem for this deck as well. Having a look at the deck list then, I want to show off first a blender list. Now, the A-Spec is actually getting more contentious within Gardevoir. I think a lot of people started off with Blender, but there has been more and more option for Secret Box, and I do think Secret Box is reasonable as well, to be honest with you, so definitely a card that I'm still monitoring and thinking about. I think the only trade-off with having to play these Secret Box is you probably have to go up in Earthen Vessel count to have at least a second copy in there to try and make it worth your while. But as we know, getting those candy combinations off is always solid, and once you get that online, we have Munkidori, which is still a huge boast. And like I said, that Clefairy plus Mew combination where you're being a Dragapult that hits Dragapult for weakness is just so devastating. So these Bravery Charms, not just for Screamtail and Drifloon these days, also trying to bulk up that Mew, put it out of range of a Dragapult, can be a really, really strong option for you. So yeah, also a tiny note with a blender is that with 3 or 4 Night Stretcher in your list, 3 in this case, you can also give yourself candy combinations, reverse engineer it that way, which is kind of cool sometimes. So you'd have to be aware of what's in hand to make the most out of this blender at times. It's not constantly going to be just 5 Psychic. There are times where you're dumping excess Ball Search cards, and like I said, you can activate your own stretches in hand a lot of the time with this card, which is also a nice niche thing to bear in mind. The other list I want to talk about, which is one that I'm really not seeing in the online spaces, this is just something that I've still been working with and ironing out from the start, really, is a build with Zoroark. Now, this list isn't playing the Mew EX, it's just playing Clefairy as an attacking threat into Dragapult, so maybe you might want to still make that space for the Mew. The reason why I haven't is that board space is tighter in this approach because you're fitting Zoroark onto your board as well. And the idea is that we lost refinements, why don't we just keep trade in the list? The only offset is that Zoroark's an annoying Pokemon to move. So I have Turo, Pad, and the 1 energy switch, which can help with Munkidori, of course, but also is a way that you can turn attach, E-switch, pay retreat out of a Zoroark if need be as well. So that's what I'm trying to do here, to incorporate the Zoroark package. And even though Zoroark is likely just going to be like a 1-1 line on your board in a lot of these instances, that additional draw is certainly welcome, so you can still stitch together those Iono combos turn by turn and whatever else while you're still accumulating your board. But the other thing to bear in mind is that it also opens up that TM Evolution to be a really strong card in the deck again. And I think that makes the Arven far stronger. One of the issues of the straight Gardevoirs now, like the usual builds, is that they're research and Iono based, and sometimes you end up discarding painful pieces. By having Zoroark and Arven as those still the core supporters, and still the core way that you draw cards is via trade, that means that you can keep control of all of your resources that little bit tighter, and it means that you just have much more access to the cards that you need when you need them. So TM Evo also protects you against Budgie a lot better as well, of course, so that you're going immediately into Curlier, immediately into a Zoroark, and then even if you're getting locked down by a Budgie, it's much more likely that you can at least evolve into a Gardevoir and put possibly even some pressure on. So I think if you're really fearing Budgie, having TM Evo and of course Zoroark could be a really nice solution. So definitely something that I'm still toying around with. The counts are by no means set in stone, but I'm really surprised that we haven't seen more integration of Zoroark just in decks, because we're so used to Zoroark being all singing and all dancing because of old Zoro GX, of course, where it could attack with Writer's Beating as well as be an Engine Mon. But I feel like Zoroark can be more and more frequently just an ability within decks. There's going to be another archetype we look at later with the Archaladon, where Zoroark is just here to draw cards. And that's also something I think this deck could easily do because of the synergy TM Evo has in here, especially with, Box and Quad Arven. You have really good odds to get that Evo off when you choose to go second, and that's just a huge boast, I think. So definitely still something worth considering. May not be in time for Atlanta, of course, because just a few days away now, but I wanted to represent this as another way of playing Guardy, because I do still feel like the value of TM Evo is still really high right now. Moving on to number 7, we have Hop Zacian. Now, I'm stunned by this deck. It has been popular online, of course, and it was a deck that we got for free on the Battle Pass, so maybe it's a little bit inflated just purely off of that. But its data is really outperforming anything that we saw in Japan, and, even though it does have swaves of players going for the deck, it's actually performing okay. It's decent into Dragapult, Charizard, and even Terrabox, which is a big surprise to me. It does have a few awkward matchups, that tanky Archaladon where your math doesn't quite easily line up and you can't start taking those early game prize cards so easily. Gardevoir, also a bit of an awkward one. Golden Go seeming difficult, as well as the tanky Terrapagos archetype again that can shut down a lot of your easy damage outputs. I think Hop Zacian's in this weird position where sometimes you can have that early game pressure and then see it through with your Crams and Snorlax, but that has to be on basic multi-prizes a lot of the time, and if it's slightly more out of range, like that Golden Go or like Gardevoir swinging, that sort of stuff, that's where it gets really dicey. And similar to like a Dragapult, there's so much Monkey Dory around that can offset the math that you're trying to set up. That can still be worrying. So even though this is on the data right now, the 7th best performing deck, I actually think it's more than likely going to drop than go up in this tier list. So it's at 7 now, but I think throughout this format, it's only going to decrease. That said, the list I do have is a fairly standard one, to be honest with you. I do like the Tatsugiri in here. I like a fairly elevated count of the Jet in addition to Switch within the deck. I think I prefer these high counts than having Latias EX in the list, just because that's another bench space, and it's another multi-prize Pokemon, because one thing this deck actually can do fairly well is time the Zacian being the only multi-prizer in play for the first attack. Then you're giving yourself the option to cram on multiple turns, which I think is the big sell of this deck. If you go Zacian, give up your 2, even if you've just taken 1 prize in the process, then you can go cram into cram whilst you're manually attaching to Snorlax. That's when the deck can actually start feeling quite dangerous. But you have to play your board accordingly. So having the Tatsugiri in play gives you a little bit of protection from Iono spam early or even a stamp or whatnot, because without that I feel like it can be a little bit out of control. And that Latias EX just means you can't make that play happen either, because of so frequently you have to use the Lati to actually get your Zacian in the active in the first place. So having the high Jet switch is definitely the way to go to try and force the selling point of the deck, which is actually the single prizes, to be honest. The Cram and the Snorlax are the big sells of the list, more often than not. Trying to weave those in for dangerous damage output and then have the late game sweep of Blood Moon is kind of the only way this deck goes about things. So you have to be really careful about where you're taking your prizes and keep things open for you for later. And this deck can definitely get wrecked by opponents using Turo, like effectively removing threats that you're looking to finish on. those are some of the concerns of the deck, but it's really about how you play this one. You definitely don't just like start slamming down your multi-prizes. Like normally having Fez EX in play is like one of the best things you can do to protect yourself, but in this case I think it actually hurts the deck to do that. That's why you see the low count of the Zacian here, and the sort of Crams and Snorlax maintaining their 2 spaces each because they're so integral to the list. Moving on to number 6, we have Raging Bolt. This is quite popular online, you know, it's an archetype we've known previously. It does have a bit of an engine overhaul, you know, we lost the turbo package, but with the Noctowl engine, it seems to still have a really good shot here, where you have still the draw power from Teal Dance and Sada, but now Noctowl can go cherry-picking these pieces as well, which is really nice. It also gives you Fan Rotom for an early pressure poking attacker if need be, which is underrated, really, for how solid it is. And Area Zero Underdepths allows us to just have the Fez EX in play, the Latias EX, everything we need to stay smooth and consistent as a basic attacking deck. Its matchup data is reasonable. The worst ones seem to be Gardevoir as well as a straight Dragapult, although it does seem to do much better into the Dragapult Dusknoir, which is by far the more popular build and the build that's had more earnings in terms of points if we're converting these online spaces, which we've done for the video. So that's interesting. Slight unfavored into Charizard, Terrabox slightly unfavored as well, and the tanking Terrapagos also like a little bit unfavored, but overall it feels like you're still keeping decks honest, you're still very consistent, and you're still trying to pull off your strategy and impose your, you know, high damage output threat from a high hit point tanky basic, and that still is quite effective. Let's have a look at the deck list then. Like I said, Jewel Seeker's in here, the Fan Rotom to get things going. I'm quite limited on single prize attackers. I just have Fan Rotom and then Slitherwing. I feel like Slitherwing is still valuable to get through Pikachu, but there is argument for Koraidon to be in here, and the single prize Baby Roaring Moon as well, Raging Bolt, I should say, as well. I have been really underwhelmed by Baby Bolt. This is contentious though, because I know that sometimes just taking out the bench threats is the best thing you can do, and of course there is no bench protection going on right now, so you can actually make the most out of a card like that, but I still feel like 60 is never a number you want to hit. Committing 3 energy to that card is still a little bit ugly. The only thing I will say is that the more single prize Ancient Men that you put into your deck, the more you can activate Sada for multiple attachments, and at the same time it's also going to be nice against Farigiraf, which is sometimes an issue for the deck. So if you really want to have the answers, you can weave more of those in. At the moment, I have Mew EX, which has kind of been out of vogue in Raging Bolt, but I do think there's a lot of these archetypes like Gardevoir and like Dragapult that are going to try and avoid Fez, and they're so good at dealing with your Hoot Hoot that you can be left with nothing in play that can draw you cards from Iono. So having the combination of Pheasantipity and Mew and Hoot Hoots, like at least some of those are going to draw you a couple cards to see you over the line, because it feels like oftentimes you're going to be ahead in that race, you're going to be disrupted, and then if they're playing around, they'll flip the script, then suddenly you can be left at like the 1 or 2 cards that you were given. But having that Mew at least gives you that small extension to see you over the line. And let's face it, Mew EX is never like a bad card to see. It's another good lead in the deck. You know, it's just another really, really solid ability generally in the list. I'm playing one Bravery Charm. You could still consider the Ancient Booster Capsule if you are worried about the Poison package potentially going into some decks. I think it's most likely Archaladon would be the one to keep in mind right now. That would be a consideration, but right now I think the Bravery Charm, just being the more versatile option that can go onto any of your Pokemon, is the correct choice. And there's not too much to say about the items or just general consistency staples going on here. The Professor Turo is in here mostly for corner trapping strategies. If you're aware of Wellspring and you're aware of Totodile, even Maractus or Knackle or whatever it is, having Palpad, Prime Catcher and Turo gives you at least a few options, few opportunities to get yourself out of a lock, so something to bear in mind there. Onto Golden Go in at number 5. This is an interesting one in that it does have some decent favourables, actually. Solid into the Dragapult Dusknoir, the Gardevoir, the Archaladon, and the Enzoroark. All some nice boasts there, to be honest with you. Having that high damage output at your disposal is still phenomenal, and having those small bits of healing in the deck, the Turo Scenario as well as the Monkey Dory, that when you can weave it in is still really, really helpful. Also a nice thing to bear in mind is that you do have an inbuilt Wall Breaker with the Dunsparce EX as that one-of in the deck, that can help you get through those pesky Pokemon when need be, which was previously an issue for Golden Go. There have been tournaments where people have just shoved in one cornerstone and said that's a win condition into Golden Go. We've even seen, you know, the Strike It Rich single prize Golden Go at times. So taking that out and having Dedunce is a much nicer solution, I think, because that Dedunce EX can also just come in clutch against other things like Raging Bolts and Terra Boxes and such. because those decks litter their benches with EXs, so that's kind of nice. It looks like you're fairly balanced into the other Noctowl builds, all even matchups into Bolt, Terrorbox, and Tank Terrapagos. That's like pretty okay when you're able to combat basically the best engine in the game. Only really looking like Charizard as a big worry. And when we're in that position, that's a pretty good place to be. I think Golden goes in a well-poised spot, so if that's one of your picks for this weekend, it wouldn't surprise me, because the data is looking pretty solid for it. And for the deck list, like I said, Dodonce is just a nice option here. Runaway Draw gives you extra synergy with your Cypher Maniac's code breaking now that we've lost the Greninja, and it's also just joining in with coin bonus in that you're amassing a large hand size as you go. You end on a huge chunk of cards. You can sit in play with this card as well with that nice 140 hit points. Your opponent's not easily going to, cash in on it with Dragapult. They're basically having to ignore it the whole time. Otherwise, they're just going to be worried about wasting damage effectively, right? So that can be nice for you. Save it for the right time for you to then draw a bunch of cards and see yourself through in the game. That's really the main thing you have to juggle here, where you're constantly trying to use Artisan to reload your dunce and continue with a strong board presence alongside your coin bonus. But yeah, very consistent deck where you've got that Adrenabrain kicking in. Actually a pretty important card in the deck, I would say, up against some of the most prevalent decks in the game that can't always one-shot the Golden Go from like Tanky Terrapagos, as well as the, of course, ever-present Dragapult that you have to be concerned about. So having the 2 Turo in the deck as well as Monkey can really help out here. In at number 4, and actually quite underperforming the expectation, is Terrorbox. This was the most popular deck online over the last couple of weeks, and its data doesn't look great, especially for a deck that's been touted as the Bediff, and this has been something I've been saying on the channel for a long time, that it is the strongest deck in the game. Its data doesn't suggest that. Now, this is like a nuanced thing, because as ever, whenever something's touted to be one of the best decks, we start to see counters come out. And one of the very unfavorables is the new tanky Terrapagos archetype, and that's really profiting from Terrorbox being popular in the online spaces, and possibly popular this weekend, is that there's going to be people ready for the Terrorbox and try and stay out of its crucial numbers, mostly by the Boufflant and Bravery Charm combination, at least in that case. But also the Archaladon is a high-profile, awkward matchup. They can easily have tanking tools or stadiums that can push themselves out of range of even Pikachu, or just make it so that Pikachu has to attack multiple times for those multi-prize KOs, and that's not easy for this deck either. So you can see why those are the unfavorables, but it doesn't boast that many favorables. You would think that it would be better into the evolution decks, because Torrential Pump can sometimes just bully them off the board, but they're only seeing as even matchups, and I think that's because there's been a big movement towards Unfair Stamp and Budew being the defense mode against this, where this deck can certainly come out the gates flying, but if the mid-game sort of stumbles because of those stamps, things can get a little bit more tricky, I would say. And that's why actually you're worse into the Pure Pult than a Dusk Pult in this case, because they are much more likely to be stamping you in response to a Torrential Pump play, which is still no doubt very, very strong, but that's something that can really help them stabilize if you don't just have what you need, your next owl after the fact. So that's an interesting thing. Also, I have to say that this is anecdotally one of the most difficult decks to play, and that might be hurting the popularity of the deck in person tournaments, because don't forget, online you see your deck list so much easier. It's all laid out for you, and you can just type on a second monitor or whatever of what your prizes are and play the game a lot smoother, whereas in person this is much more of a headache. Time constraints are an issue as well, where you're having to juggle all these things, as well as the in-game management and resources are really important for this deck. So I think this is not for the light-hearted players. This is definitely one for the tryhards, the hardcore players who want to squeeze every drop out of an archetype. So I also think that's overall hurting the data here of the deck. So I'm still going to be standing it, and I acknowledge there are some awkward matchups, but I do think that its data is hurt right now by how difficult it is to play, and to some extent that there are already counters and pitchforks ready for Terrorbox going into this tournament. The deck list, I've had a in detail video all about Terrorbox, so if you want to look back at that on the channel, certainly do so. This is a list that I'm still rocking with from maybe a week or so ago, where I like the Zarude as a wall-breaking option, but also a single-prize Pokemon that has higher damage output that can get through other single prizes. Certainly against like a tanking Terrapagos, one of the big issues is that they can Fan Rotom your Hoot Hoots and your Fan Rotom, whereas you can't do that back to them. But at least with Jungle Whip, you can do that without representing a multi-prize Pokemon into the active position. So that's one of the reasons why I like having the Zarude in here. Of course, it means that you don't have to negotiate an extra type of energy in the deck. If you want to play Cornerstone, sometimes you have to go down to 4 grass, which is a little bit awkward, but you'd like to still have that good type coverage into Zoroark and into Charizard to an extent. So I still like the Zarude in here, personally, as that wall-breaking choice. But that's really up to you if you want to make any changes there. The core of the deck is still very much the same, where I've actually stripped out Terrapagos from the list because, of course, I have the Grass Attacker now to help me through Cornerstone. But the Wellspring, the Teal Dance, the Pikachu are, as well as the Lily's Clefairy, these are like the big attackers within the deck. These are all things that you very much need to bear in mind. So yeah, some of the most powerful things in here, and the engine is still absolutely crazy. I'm convinced that this is still one of the most powerful decks in the game. That being said, there isn't really much space to tinker with to make the most out. Well, if there are these decks that can stay out of Pikachu range and we're not hitting for weakness, there's certainly going to be awkward matchups. So we have to acknowledge that to some degree. Going in at number 3 then, the 5th most popular, but certainly rising in popularity. This deck has only picked up in play in the last week and a half or 2 weeks, where there's been some high profile placements from popular players that has really elevated this deck, and a lot of people are making the pivot to this. So I wouldn't be surprised if this gained a lot of traction before Atlanta, and a lot of people are looking at this over the likes of Raging Bolt or over the likes of Terrabox themselves, because the matchup data is looking really freaking appealing. One of the big boasts here is that your Terrabox matchup is very, very favorable, and then you're also doing pretty well into Dragapult, Dusknoir, and Guardy, as well as Raging Bolt, Archaladon. You know, this is the big top tier stuff. It looks like Tanky Terrapagos has a good time into all of those. Has an even time into the Golden Go. Has a slightly weaker time into a purely Dragapult-esque deck, which is quite interesting. And it's also unfavorable into Charizard, just because they can manipulate the prize race much more so than you can, and the tankiness doesn't matter too much to Charizard, to be honest with you. They will find a way through you, whether or not they're using their Dustoir on your booth, or they're just reaching so high with their maximum belt and the Inferno Rain getting that dangerous. But yeah, that's like the only bad matchup, and Charizard was low on our tier list, so that's a good thing to be bad against, if that makes sense. The deck list is, again, something I've been testing online a little bit and streamed a bit of this deck, to be honest with you. I'm still not completely set on the counts because I'm a little bit lower on supporters than the majority of other people, in that you often see 1 or 2 research in addition to the supporters that I have right now. But I do really value that 4th Ultra Ball within the deck, and I do think that you're prioritizing other supporters on the majority of turns. So I'm quite happy with this overall, and I've always found that Research was an awkward card in Terrabox. It's an awkward card in this deck as well. So I would play 1 rather than 2, to be honest with you, if I had to make a space for it. But yeah, I think this is definitely reasonable. Also worth noting that if you want to not play Cornerstone, you certainly can cut that. And there's also a debate whether or not you should play Jet Energy in the deck as well. So that's another thing that you could bear in mind. And it's also really up in the air what the best A spec is. Scoop Cyclone is currently the most popular, but you could easily see Prime catch it in here as well. So more to consider with this deck, but definitely like a rising star in the format that is outperforming its play rates and having really good data right now as well. In at number 2, then we have Archaladon. Now it's joint the 3rd most popular online. That's the combination of Archaladon with the Dunsparce, with Hop's Dubwool, with Zoroark EX, as well as the Poison package. So the data set that you're looking at might be a little bit skewed because I'm having to combine the 2 different ways that Arch is played into just one data set. So do bear with me with that one. If there's anything that looks strange, of course, this is just the online data anyway, so more discussion in the comments down below as always. But in general, Archaladon, tanky, difficult Pokemon to deal with, has potential healing with the Turo in basically every situation you're trying to build this card. The Dunsparce helps with the draw power, which can help you use those Power Spike supporters, whereas the Dubwool is much more focused on just taking those easier prize cards with Metal Defender and racing that a little bit more effectively. And the Zoroark is kind of between the 2, where it's giving you draw power, but it's allowing more multi-prizes to be in play. But it also has that synergy with discarding those metal energy as you go and whatnot. So really interesting to see how Archaladon is developing and how it's placed itself in the format, where pretty reasonable into the Dragapult. You know, you have the Relicanth, you have Damage Mod available to you to be frustrating for them. Whether you're playing the Poison package or whether you're playing Black Belts in a tanking deck with Relicanth, those can be awkward for you. Of course, the healing is generally good for you as well. It also seems to be annoying for the Terrabox just because there's so much hit points to get through, even if you're not adding tanking tools. The fact that Pikachu is lent into more and more frequently in that matchup is like pretty reasonable for you, especially because you have Poison or sometimes Vengeful Punch in your deck, so that's okay. The big warning sign for this archetype is going to be the Raging Bolts that can one-hit KO you, same for Golden Go, and the tanky Terrapagos as well makes your numbers a little bit less powerful, I would say. Let's have a look at a couple lists. The first one I'm going to look at is the Poison build. This one is contentious because I know a lot of people don't love the fact that this is a cheesy deck that is trying to win before the opponent can play a card. Never a nice feeling, of course. But that's not to take away that in a long game situation, this deck is still powerful in that you can initiate that prize race without activating Flip the Script from the opponent. And indeed, throughout the game, you can be using INO, taking a knockout whilst not activating Flip the Script. And so many decks need that Flip the Script to make themselves feel confident out of a hand disruption. So that's something you have to really consider, that is still like a long game boast that the deck has. It's not all about the donk here. Of course, that's a way to steal wins and best of 3. That's really nice to have that at your disposal. But simply the fact that this doesn't trigger Flip the Script for a majority of turns in the game is really, really powerful and potent, I would say. So not something to be slept on. It's a simplistic deck. The engine is a little bit whack, I'm not going to lie. Like, nothing feels good about discard and draw 5. It's not discard to draw 7. But the fact that it enables a win condition on turn 1 is something that you really shouldn't shrug at, because sometimes you do get those free rounds, and that's sometimes it's very powerful to lean back on, that sometimes, hey, you can get lucky and then just win on the spot. The other list I want to look at is going to be the Zoroark Arch, where I do think this is probably the better partner compared to the Dunce. Obviously, if you want to have that wall breaker, we have Zacian to help you at least get through the Cornerstone, as well as being just a decent attacker in its own right. But also, you have your baby Duras that can hammer in and Raging Hammer through Mimikyu as well. So you do cover your bases somewhat with this list without the Dunsparce EX, and Trade is just a better ability generally, but specifically in this list, it opens up the Cyrano supporter for us to get multiple EXs immediately. That's our attacker, that's our draw engine, all from this one supporter card, and of course we are playing those Poké Gear as well, that can help us turn 1 to get Arven, which gets us Trolley, which gets all of our basics developed, but at that same merit on like turn 2, we can be fishing for those Cyranos, or the 2 of supporters in here as well. Boss, of course, very strong, Disruption from Iono, the Turo for healing, and there is the cheeky Black Belts training in here as well, so you can represent that threat against the Guardies and against the Dragapults, where you have Relicanth, Black Belt, and Raging Hammer as a potential attacking line. There is the Copium Vengeful Punch that's trying to help out a little bit against Pikachu. At the same time, the Hop Zacian might be able to chip in there. You've got the Itchy Pollen as well, which if you really have to, you can do. So we have a few ways to prod a peak in here. It's nowhere near as consistent as the Poison package in that regard, but it's still something you can go for, and this does have a feel of the old Zoroark decks, to be honest with you, where Archaladon is just a self-sufficient, easy attacker that you can pick up and put down if need be, similar to back in the day when we were using Acerola on our Zoros and our Golysopods. That is something that this deck is able to recreate, which is a really nice feeling, I have to admit. So this is a fun deck. Again, maybe too early for many players to commit to this for Atlanta, but I also know that Archaladon has been popular for a number of tournaments, and we know the power level is strong behind this card generally, just because its stats are silly for a stage 1, and that's still carrying a lot of this deck, to be honest with you. In at number 1, then, we have Dragapult Dustoir. That's the deck that's the best performing right now and has the most popularity behind it. But quickly divert your eyes to the top of the screen, where the data behind a no Dustoir build is actually far superior to a Dustoir build. Really important to note as well is that the pure Dragapult is favoured in the mirror compared to a Dustoir build. That's because very frequently you're Bodooing them so they can't candy into their Dustoirs, and then suddenly the Dragapult, the straight build, is able to take knockouts on the Duskull before they evolve, and that's essentially rendered that whole element of this deck useless, whilst at the same time they play Monkey Dory, which can undo your Phantom Dive math, and suddenly they're also going to be KOing your Draklux that little bit easier. So the pure Pult is favoured in mirror, and actually has better matchups in a lot of these other things. In this case, where we're looking at the Dustoir build, its only 60% plus matchup is Charizard, compared to a pure Pult can be good in the mirror It can be just as good into Zard. It can also be better into Gardevoir and better into Raging Bolt. So all of those are better boasts, and also you improve your matchup into Tanky Terapagos and Terrabox. So low-key, I think a Pure Pult is stronger for this weekend. So if you've been practicing Pure Pult, similar to how the Fernandez brothers were doing it for a number of the regionals and IC's last format, I think adapting that list, and I'll show that list in a moment, is actually the sleeper best deck in format. The Pure Pult is not within the top 10 of popularity. I think it was like 12 or so in the online scene, and its data is absolutely bonkers, to be honest with you. So I low-key think that Pure Pult is the best deck in the format, but the popularity and the results right now are behind a Dusknoir build. And in this case, you can see the matchup data is a little bit more sus around this deck. I think more people are ready for this list. The only caveat to a pure Dragapult compared to a Dusknoir build is that you do have a much weaker time into that Archaladon, which is a fairly balanced matchup when you play Dusknoir, but absolutely awful when you don't have Dusknoir in your deck. Also worth noting that the pure Dragapult has far weaker answers to the walling stuff, whereas Dusknoir inherently is an answer to walls in that you can just start blasting them instead, rather than having to Phantom Dive through them. So that's something you have to bear in mind. Against the top tier stuff, Pure Pult, very, very strong. Dusknoir gives you ways to beat a wider field of matchups, including that Archaladon, which is a high tier matchup that you have to consider. But I feel like a calculated risk could easily be a Pure Pult this weekend. I low-key think that could be the best deck in the format right now. Let's quickly look at a Dusknoir build. I like 222. Again, when you're facing other Pults, evolving up into Clops is so important so that you can actually get Curse Blasting. That's how you gain the advantage in this matchup. If you can't get to Curse Blast, what's the point? So I'm taking that Natalie Miller approach where by having the 2-stage ones, you can at least find them and get into them and actually find your way towards Dusknoir, which is a big deal. Also, I like having the 222 thick line just because it can allow you to use those stretches more effectively, and you know, you don't have to worry about prizing one of your Dusknoir pieces or the Dusclops pieces, so you can actually just get that off. And again, when you're up against the walling matchups, which you see a bunch online at least, having that full thick line, even without a rod, means that you can still get enough uses out of them to be relevant to like wall break. So that's nice. I think the only real contentious debate right now, well, certainly in Dusknoir, there's still the debate over Crystal versus Stamp, whereas I think a pure Dragapult is basically always playing Stamp. You'll notice that I'm teching both Crystal and EXP share. Normally it's an either-or situation where you play Stamp, you play EXP, but because I'm expecting Golden Go for this tournament, I like having both. It means that you continue to Phantom Dive throughout that entire game, and I think one of the main advantages Golden Go has, now that we're moving away from Luminion Crispin, you know, post-rotation, this list having Crystal then into EXP share means you do just chain those Phantom Dives that little bit better. Same can be said for the Terrabox matchup and the Raging Bolt matchup. These matchups that will just chase Pulse no matter what and essentially chase your energy and starve you of Phantom Dive. Having both Crystal and EXP share means that you're not whiffing on the best attack in the game, and that's still my biggest boast. So that's the thing I've been enjoying a lot with this list. I do have the one Jacques in here, but I still have the TM Evolution. Bit of a tug of war there. I know some people just like to cut TM Evo altogether and have an elevated Jacques count or have the Brock Scouting in here. That's definitely something I could still foresee being reasonable. But yeah, I've been really enjoying the Dusknoir build online, but the list I've been enjoying even more is that straight Dragapult. Now, Straight Pole almost always just plays the Stamp. I have a couple of Jacques in here as well, and I do play that Crispin, but that's because we also have Monkey Dory support in here as well. So Crispin and EXP Share come into this deck list to try and give you that little bit of extra push to make sure that you, again, are sticking to your Phantom Dives, but also find the wiggle room to get the Adrenabrain off so that you can be dangerous there. Klefki's a really nice inclusion that can shut down Fan Rotom, which sometimes you can just absolutely wreck people from that alone. But at the same merits, you can bring up Latias EX and go Klefki, and that can be a lot more stable of an option to buy yourself time against the racing decks, certainly Terrabox, than a Panic Itchy Pollen. It's very often that off of Itchy Pollen, if they already have a Mew EX down or something like that, they can just hit Noctowl and do it again, and then you're really behind. Whereas if you can go Countercatcher, Klefki, trap the Latias, suddenly you're in a much safer position where it's hard for them to do much at all, because even if they're using their Turo, they're not using Crispin and reloading a Wellspring Ogerpon. They have to be able to Turo plus E-switch with the Ogerpon, and that's not always easy, right, with Teal Dance. They need to have a bigger combination of cards to actually do anything in that spot, and they're spending Turo at that stage in the game rather than later on in a healing instance where you try to set up math and they're removing that from the board. Knowing that their Turo has gone earlier allows you to, with more confidence, set up damage for game. So that's just already like a nice trade-off, even if they get the high roll situation. So yeah, I think Klefki is actually a pretty big card. Has early game, just like high roll situations where you can win in spots you may not expect just by leading the card, but at the same merits, is a safer way to stop the flow of a Terror Box, which I think is a really big deal, especially with that stamp in here as well, of course. So that's where you can get really awkward. I do like the one candy in here, even though we are going to be looking to those slow Volve, Itchy Pollen plays and build a board behind it. I do still feel like that's a decent shout there to have the potential aggression if need be, and if you have just happened to see energy early or whatnot, just to have that pressure when need be. And the Rod is an interesting one in here as well, just somewhat trying to save space, but also so that you can reload Crispin if you have to, but also reload like Monkey plus Dark. It's quite often that you can Rod then Artisan immediately and at least get the Monkey back and try and work towards that Dark energy. So that's something to bear in mind there. Just outside the top 10, there are a few awkward decks. It feels weird to not have within the top 10 any of these walling decks, but for Alligator, of course, had that big placement in the Champions League. Walling decks also did really well at the Champions League and are still doing like okay in the online spaces. Actually, their win rate is quite poor. But also Frostas Monkey Dory is one that I am personally championing. I think that's the best of the bunch that I'm talking about here, in that you can be really annoying for a lot of these ability engine mons, which is Drakcloak and Noctowl, which is a big portion of the formats just then and there. But having the combination of Budju plus Blood Moon plus Maractus is really, really dangerous, actually. So I low-key think that Frostas Monkey is pretty good. It also had a high-profile performance at the most recent Champions League, which is in a slightly more advanced format, but still applicable here to show that it can go far even in like multi-thousand player tournaments if there's enough people piloting the deck. So it is still definitely an undercurrent of this format that walling mons are a pain. Trapping is definitely a strategy, whether it's Sob, whether it's from a Totodile, or whether it's from Maractus as well. So do bear all of those in mind. And then just popping out the top 10, Roaring Moon's been surprising online. It's incorporating that Petrunt poison package as well, and having the jungle and Mochi and whatnot means that Roaring Moon can actually do pretty decent damage and isn't forced to constantly gouge, which is kind of interesting. And because you are playing that high of a count of the ancient booster capsules, you can also just be quite a tanky moon, which is annoying for a few decks as well. So had some surprising results. Yes, it's a little bit awkward that you have to rely on Sada and E-Switch now that you've lost Dark Patch. So you need to like really white knuckle Sadas and get maximum value out of them every single turn of the game. But you naturally sit with Brute Bonnet in play anyway, so that's just a general E-Switch mon regardless. So I think you can still just about get by with a deck, and it's something we didn't have on our tier list, and maybe we should have given it more attention because it has had some decent results. Not quite enough to make it into the top 10, but just outside. Flareon, just another Jewel Seeker deck, to be honest with you. There's so many options with Noctowl. It's really pick your favourites, and if Flareon's your favourite, then go for it. There are some cool tricks it has up its sleeve. It has the space for multiple Buddy Poffin as well, that at least gets you around Klefki. So that's kind of interesting, where you're less reliant on Fan Rotom than all the other lists, if that makes sense, that are Jewel Seeking. Because I think certainly Terror Box, which is so precise, but even like the Raging Bots and whatnot, if they're not able to get that fan call off, the deck can feel so much weaker. Whereas this list at least has the multiple Poffin behind it to at least get its full basic suite out anyway, which is kind of cool. And yeah, it does have those high roll moments where sometimes you just randomly attack with Flareon really early and it can be dangerous. And then that final note is for Future Hands. Really interesting that you can play 59 cards of a list that actually won a tournament in the previous format, in like what was a situation where every other deck has got far weaker. This deck literally changes one card and it would be like a switch card to a regular switch. So if you want to play literally a tournament winning deck from a previous format where we had a larger card pool, go for it, because We still know that Iron Hands is inherently broken. We know that the single prize Miraidon is not too shabby either. And the list doesn't need to change. We have the blueprints of the deck before, and it doesn't have to adapt too much. So Iron Hands not being present in the format is a strange feeling for how relevant it's been for so long. And maybe this is the deck to open the door again for Ampy very much to still be a threat in the metagame, because it feels like people aren't having to prepare for that card anywhere near as much as they used to in the past. And if they're not prepared for Ampy very much, sometimes it just runs away with games. So definitely have to still put respect on the name of future hands. I feel like that could still go far, to be honest with you. So yeah, overall, very interesting stuff. I think if I was going to Atlanta, I would be playing a Dust Noir Lus Dragapult, to be honest with you. I think that's the right call for this tournament, in that you're good in the Dragapult mirror, and generally Monkey Dory is just a good combination with Dragapult, and Unfair Stamp can cheese all sorts of games, especially behind Budju. Let me know your thoughts down below. What's the deck that you're bringing to the tournaments? What have you been prepping with? What's your favourite way to play Noctowl? And what decks are going to creep into this top 10 and dethrone some of the decks like the Hopsashin and possibly even Charizard that have been having a bit of a rough time and just hanging on for now? I'll hear it all down below. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you tomorrow for another video. Cheers.